I told her straight up that I wasn't part of her HOA, and she reacted like I'd just admitted to some serious crime. There I was, sweaty, clutching a rake, barely finished tidying up my own yard. Out of nowhere, this stranger I'd never laid. Izon started yelling about bylaws like she governed the entire county. At first I figured maybe she was mistaken. Then I started questioning whether I was. But the second she said, "People like you always cause problems," I knew this wasn't about neighborhood rules at all. Something deeper was off here. So tell me, what would you do if someone called the cops on you just for raking your own yard? I was fixing up my fence when Cynthia Cole marched over, half the neighborhood following behind her like some bizarre parade. She jabbed a finger toward my lake and announced to everyone in earshot, "That's an HOA amenity right there." I paused mid-hammer, staring at her. Was she serious? Claiming my lake belonged to the HOA? For weeks I'd been getting absurd violation letters, Cynthia insisting that some supposed boundary change had magically pulled my ranch into their jurisdiction. It was surreal, like watching someone try to hotwire your car while you're sitting in the driver's seat. The truth was, Cynthia had her eyes on my lake. She wanted to brand it as an amenity to inflate property values in her listings. She'd been president of the Willowbrook Heights HOA for 3 years, but apparently that wasn't enough power for her. There she stood, khaki pants pressed, polo shirt neatly tucked, clipboard hugged to her chest like armor, telling me how things were going to be. "You need to follow community standards just like everyone else, Jack," she said, voice dripping with that syrupy fake sweetness that makes your stomach turn. I wondered if she practiced that tone in front of the mirror. I kept driving the fence post, eyes down. "That's interesting, Cynthia, because I'm not in your HOA. My voice was calm, but I felt the air around us tighten. She froze for a solid 3 seconds, and I swear I could hear her mind grinding through the words. Then her face went red, and she fumbled with her phone like it was a weapon. "We'll see about that," she snapped, and before I knew it, she was dialing 911 over a property line dispute. I had to stop just to take her in. The little crowd behind her started murmuring, some confused, others nodding along like this was totally normal. Tom Harris, lanky guy in his 50s from 3 houses down, bobbed his head in agreement like one of those dashboard figurines. Emily Reed, who usually kept to herself, hovered at the edge, quietly snapping photos on her phone. I couldn't tell if she was entertained or just gathering evidence for the record. Within 15 minutes, Deputy Carl Benson pulled into my driveway, lights flashing, looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. The poor guy climbed out, approached slowly, probably bracing for some domestic mess. Cynthia launched straight into her speech, dramatizing how I was defying community regulations and creating a hostile environment. You'd think I was running a cartel instead of fixing a fence on my own land? The deputy listened politely, nodding, but I could read his face. He'd seen HOA drama before and wasn't buying the act. "So what's the actual emergency here?" he asked, glancing between us with the tired patience of someone who'd played referee too many times. I pointed to my fence and explained I was on my own property, outside any HOA boundaries. Cynthia waved her clipboard, insisting some new community amendment had magically extended their reach to my ranch. When Benson asked to see it, she started backpedaling, claiming it was still in process. The deputy gave her a long, unimpressed look, then explained that 911 was meant for real emergencies, not neighborhood squabbles. He suggested working things out like grown adults before involving law enforcement again. Cynthia's jaw tightened. This clearly wasn't the outcome she wanted. When he finally drove off, leaving her with a warning about abusing emergency services, I glanced at the onlookers. Tom seemed less sure about where his loyalty lay. Emily was still filming, likely, catching every second of the drama. A few others whispered among themselves, eyes darting between me and Cynthia, like they were picking sides in a game. I lifted that fence post a notch higher, partly because no one was stopping me, partly to prove a point about property rights. Cynthia's eyes tracked every movement, sharp and calculating. When our gazes met, she gave me a smile that made my skin crawl, like she knew something I didn't. "Around here, the laws go through me," she said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear, not the others. Maybe I was imagining it, but it felt like a threat. The way she stood there, confident, smug, like she held some hidden ace, made me uneasy. I had the real county map folded in my pocket, proof of my property lines. I almost pulled it out then and there, but something told me to wait. Better to see what other tricks Cynthia might try before I laid my cards on the table. Sometimes the smartest move is to let your opponent believe they're ahead while you quietly gather information. As the others drifted back toward the subdivision, I stayed at the fence, pretending to work while my head spun with everything that had just unfolded. What had Cynthia really been plotting all this time? Those letters hadn't been random annoyances. They were calculated steps in a larger plan. She'd been laying the groundwork for something bigger, something that depended on rallying the neighborhood against me. I'd purchased this ranch outright, paid every dollar myself, and poured sweat into turning it into what it is. And now this HOA president, drunk on her own authority, thought she could claim it as some kind of community asset. It was so ridiculous it almost would have been funny. If it wasn't happening to me, I didn't know her exact endgame, but the whole thing left me with a pit in my stomach. The next morning, there it was, a glaring yellow citation taped to my front gate, fluttering in the wind like some kind of mock surrender flag. Dock and fence violations, it read in bold type, complete with a case number and all the trappings of official paperwork. I read it twice, struggling to process the sheer gall of it. This was my land, well outside HOA borders, and they were trying to penalize me for improvements I'd built with my own hands. Daily fines loomed unless I complied with community standards. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or call a lawyer. The document looked polished enough. Letterhead, legal phrasing, the works. Something that would fool most people at a glance. But I wasn't most people. Cynthia had clearly spent her weekend gearing up for battle, and this notice was just the first shot in what promised to be an all-out war over my property rights. By noon, she'd already scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called the Jack Miller situation, as if I were some crisis threatening the neighborhood. Tom Harris even left me a voicemail, sounding half apologetic but urging me to attend to clear things up, as if there were any confusion about who owned my land. Still, I decided I should go. Better to face whatever spectacle Cynthia had planned and shut it down with facts before it spun completely out of control. I thought back to the last autumn I spent here with my father. He'd carved a fishing rod, handle for me out of hickory, handing it over like it was family treasure. We sat at the edge of the dock I now wake up to, and he told me, "You'll come back when you're tired of people pretending to be in charge." That line had been echoing louder every day. That evening, the community center was packed. Far more people than usually bothered with HOA meetings. Word had spread, and folks wanted a front row seat to the drama. Cynthia had gone all out. Projector, neatly designed slides about community growth, even printed programs like it was a stage production instead of a property dispute. I had to admit she knew how to put on a show. This cabin wasn't just quiet. It held memories. Her entire case was built on fabrications, but she delivered it with such conviction people believed her. She had doctored maps that looked official, forged signatures on altered documents, even a fabricated timeline showing when this so-called expansion supposedly happened. Twisted as it was, the amount of effort she'd put into creating a fake legal framework was almost impressive. When she finally opened the floor, I stood and asked to see the original county records proving these boundary changes. Cynthia smiled. That cold smile, and said the documents were working through the proper channels and would be available in due course, which was lawyer speak for I'm bluffing and hoping nobody calls me on it. That's when Emily Reed spoke up from the back. She'd been recording parts of the presentation on her phone, and during one of Cynthia's slides on community finances, she caught something Cynthia probably wished she hadn't revealed. The HOA maintenance fund was deep in the red. Suddenly, Cynthia's obsession with turning my lake into an HOA amenity made perfect, if infuriating, sense. She wasn't just chasing power. What she really wanted was to fix the HOA's money troubles by taking someone else's land and turning it into profit. Her plan was simple. The lake would draw new buyers, drive up home values, and maybe even justify raising the HOA dues. On paper, it was a clever idea. if you ignored the small fact that it was blatantly illegal and morally rotten. Instead of getting into a public shouting match with Cynthia in front of her supporters, where she held the advantage, I chose a smarter route. The next morning, I drove to the county office and asked to review the official property records for my ranch. The clerk, a kind woman who looked like she'd been working there since the day the building opened, pulled up the files, printed me a fresh copy of the boundary map, and slid it across the counter. Clear as day, the map showed my land sat completely outside the HOA's reach. The ink was still crisp. She even cracked a joke about how some HOAs loved to claim land they had no authority over, as though she'd seen this nonsense many times before. While we talked about boundary disputes, she mentioned that she'd been seeing more cases lately, often tied to neighborhoods struggling with upkeep costs. Sometimes HOAs get desperate when the money doesn't add up, she said, tucking my paperwork back into its folder. That's when they start trying solutions that aren't exactly legal. Her words made me think harder about what pressures might be fueling Cynthia's push. I spread that county map across the hood of my truck in the parking lot, tracing every line, every marking, every notation that confirmed my land was completely separate from Willowbrook Heights. There was even a buffer zone of open county land between us. No court would ever uphold Cynthia's claims. Still, she wasn't backing down, which told me there was more at stake here than just neighborhood amenities or property values. When I got home, an email was waiting. No name attached, just a generic address that could have belonged to anyone. Inside were scanned documents that made me stop mid-sip, coffee going cold in my hand. They were the original community contracts, the real ones, exposing exactly what Cynthia had falsified to expand the HOA's boundaries. Someone inside was feeding me intel, making sure I saw just how deep Cynthia's deception ran. The real question was whether this anonymous source was trying to save me or bait me into a worse trap. Looking back, I should have realized that message would either be my salvation or my downfall. Cynthia smiled when she saw the county map. Why would someone losing be so pleased? 3 days later, she made her move. She sent out what she called updated community rule amendments, claiming, "My ranch was now officially part of the HOA under some expanded jurisdiction policy. Everyone in the neighborhood got a copy, printed on thick paper with odd fonts to make it look legitimate." But I wasn't fooled. The margins were off, the alignment sloppy, and the whole thing had the look of a homemade forgery. Sitting at my kitchen table, I read through the fake amendments, amazed at how far she was willing to carry this charade. For a DIY job, it was fairly polished. She'd lifted phrasing from real legal codes and HOA bylaws, sprinkled in fake board signatures, and even made up reference numbers that sounded official. To the untrained eye, it might have passed, but to anyone familiar with real legal documents, the flaws jumped out. Legal filings don't have uneven spacing, and they don't cite municipal codes that don't exist. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white as I drove back to the county office. Sometimes I think I picked the wrong career. I should have studied law instead of learning to swing a hammer and run wiring, because here I was, dealing with someone who thought she could rewrite property law with an inkjet printer. The county clerk didn't even try to hide her laughter when she looked at Cynthia's amendments. "Honey, this isn't how boundary changes happen," she said, pointing out glaring mistakes. "You can't just declare someone else's property part of your HOA by mailing out a fancy-looking document. Real boundary modifications require surveys, public hearings, and county approval." She even dug out the original incorporation papers for Willowbrook Heights, clearly showing what land had been included at the start. My ranch wasn't anywhere near it. She explained that even if they wanted to add my land, the process was a maze. Government agencies, public hearings, endless paperwork. Most HOAs never even attempted it. And most importantly, they'd need my written consent. No one could force me into their HOA. Cynthia's amendments weren't just fraudulent, they showed a complete ignorance of how the law actually worked. As we continued talking, the clerk shared examples of similar disputes she'd handled. "I've been seeing more of these cases," she said, pulling out a folder filled with complaints. "Communities in financial trouble often get creative with their interpretations of jurisdiction." She showed me one case about a shared access road where the HOA had fallen behind on a loan and overreached its authority. That one grabbed my attention immediately. The parallels were impossible to miss, especially after what Emily had revealed about Willowbrook Heights' maintenance fund deficit. It all made sense. If the HOA was drowning financially, Cynthia's land grab wasn't just about amenities. She wanted to turn my lake into a community feature that could justify raising dues to cover their debts. She wasn't just stealing property, she was trying to use me to bail out their bad money management. That night, another email from my anonymous contact arrived. This time it was worse. Attached were both Cynthia's doctored contract and the untouched original. The differences were staggering. Altered dates, rewritten property descriptions, forged signatures, all crafted to support her boundary expansion. Story. Looking at the side-by-side comparison on my screen, I had to set my coffee cup down before I spilled it everywhere. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was outright fraud. My anonymous source had also sent over financial documents that revealed the HOA's growing debt crisis in full detail. Their maintenance account was in far worse shape than I'd realized. Unpaid invoices to contractors, overdue equipment payments, and what looked like a large loan default. The community pool sat in need of repairs they couldn't fund. The landscaping budget was already 3 months late, and multiple residents had filed complaints about neglected upkeep. Cynthia wasn't simply hungry for power. She was scrambling to find money before the HOA collapsed entirely. I spent that evening poring over property law and HOA regulations, trying to figure out what legal tools Cynthia might try to wield against me. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that while her accusations had no legal ground, she still had the ability to bury me under nuisance lawsuits and harassment. Court battles drain you even when you're in the right, and lawyers don't work for free. Maybe that was part of her plan. Bleed me dry with legal costs until I had no choice but to give in. But giving up wasn't on the table. This was my land, purchased with years of sacrifice and hard work. Every dollar I'd scraped together went into buying this ranch. I'd spent countless nights and weekends fixing it up, shaping it into something I could be proud of. No HOA president with a clipboard and a superiority complex was going to strip that away with fabricated paperwork. The real question was whether I had enough endurance and resources to withstand what was clearly going to be a drawn-out, ugly fight. The next morning brought an unexpected twist. Tom Harris called me, his voice uneasy and apologetic. He admitted he'd done some research of his own after sitting through Cynthia's presentation, and something about her property line claims didn't check out. "I measured it myself," he said. "Your boundary is definitely not where Cynthia claims." It is. He was starting to question the entire expansion narrative, especially after seeing how aggressively Cynthia was trying to push it through without proper documentation. I thanked Tom for being upfront, glad someone was finally scrutinizing Cynthia's story instead of swallowing it whole. Still, a part of me wondered if his doubts were real, or if he was playing a longer game. In neighborhood politics, trust was rare. Property values and money made people crafty. Everyone had their own angle, and sometimes supposed allies were just maneuvering for whatever outcome suited them best. The anonymous email had armed me with valuable evidence, but it also raised unsettling questions. Who was supplying me with this information, and why? Were they sincerely trying to help me expose Cynthia's lies, or was I being set up for something far worse? From experience, I knew that when someone hands you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment, there's almost always a hidden price. The question was whether I was desperate enough to accept help without knowing the source. That email could be a lifeline or the start of a smarter trap. I should have expected what came next, but it still caught me off guard. I came home from running errands to find a tow truck already lifting my pickup onto its flatbed. A notice taped to the windshield claimed I'd violated HOA parking rules on community property. Community property, my own driveway, on land I legally owned, deed and all. For a second, I just stood there, stunned by the sheer boldness of it. The driver was a big man in oil-stained coveralls who looked like he wanted no part of this mess. When I walked up with my deed and county boundary map, his demeanor shifted. "Look, buddy, I just do the pickups I'm told to," he said, unhooking my truck without argument. "But if you've got paperwork proving this is your property, I'm not taking it." He packed up and drove off, probably shaking his head at whatever neighborhood feud he'd just stumbled into. Later, I learned that Cynthia had called 3 separate towing companies before finding one willing to show up. The first 2 pressed her for authority to authorize the tow, but this last outfit hadn't bothered with much verification beyond an address. Lucky for me, the driver himself had more sense than his office. But then the pattern shifted. One morning, I spotted a small pinewood birdhouse nailed to the tree near my dock. It hadn't been there the week before. Its tiny entrance hole was angled strangely toward my porch. I thought little of it until I noticed the faint blink of a red light inside. Not even 20 minutes after the tow truck left, Deputy Carl Benson pulled into my driveway, lights flashing. I didn't know if he was responding to yet another 911 call or following up from a prior visit, but either way, his expression showed he was tired of this circus. Cynthia had called again, this time accusing me of interfering with legitimate HOA enforcement and endangering community safety. From the way she told it, you'd think I'd threatened the tow driver instead of calmly showing him legal documents. Deputy Benson listened while I explained, studying the official county map I'd gotten from Patricia's office. He compared it to the phony boundary paperwork Cynthia waved around, shaking his head at the glaring inconsistencies. "Ma'am," he said to her, his tone edged with irritation, "false 911 calls are punishable under state law. This is the 3rd time you've summoned us over a property dispute that belongs in civil court, not on our emergency line." His patience was running thin, and he wasn't hiding it. I didn't lose my temper, though I was tempted. Instead, I pulled out my phone and began recording everything, every word, every bogus document Cynthia flashed, every false claim of authority over my land. In fights like this, evidence mattered more than outrage, and I had a sinking feeling I was going to need every piece of proof I could gather. This wasn't mere harassment anymore. It was surveillance. Someone wasn't just watching what I did. They were tracking me. They were watching me. Cynthia had shown up with Tom Harris and another resident I didn't recognize, like backup actors in some small-town play. They stood just behind her, nodding in rhythm with everything she said. Still, I noticed Tom seemed far less certain than in past encounters. Maybe his digging into the property lines had left him with more doubts than he'd admitted when we last spoke. The other resident, a woman in her 60s wearing a Willowbrook Heights polo, looked uneasy about the whole ordeal. Emily Reed was there as well, recording the scene from a safe distance on her phone. I'd grown to value her presence during these standoffs, not because I wanted an audience, but because an unbiased witness with video evidence could be crucial if things turned ugly. Through her camera, Emily caught something I nearly missed in the heat of the moment. Cynthia, in the middle of justifying herself to Deputy Benson, accidentally revealing her true motive behind all the harassment. Later that evening, I tried to speak with my neighbor June, the one who always waved from her kayak. She refused to open the door. Instead, she slid a note through the crack. "They threatened to fine me if I talked to you." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about bylaws. It was about control. While trying to defend herself, Cynthia let the truth slip. "If we turn the lake into an amenity, my listings go up in price." She seemed to forget she was being filmed. It was the perfect confession, proof that her campaign to expand boundaries was about boosting her real estate business, not protecting community interests like she claimed. Emily kept recording, catching both Cynthia's blunder and the deputy's reaction as he finally heard the real reason behind all the bogus emergency calls. Deputy Benson jotted notes into his citation book, then wrote something that made Cynthia's face drain of color. He didn't show me what it was, but his warning was unmistakable. If she called 911 again without a real emergency, there would be consequences beyond a slap on the wrist. "We have limited resources," he told her. "Every frivolous call pulls officers away from actual emergencies." The citation he handed her likely wasn't what she'd envisioned when she made the call. After everyone left, I sat on my porch, trying to process how fast things were escalating. Cynthia was becoming more desperate, more reckless. fake documents, an unauthorized tow truck, repeated misuse of emergency services. She was digging herself deeper into legal trouble while at the same time strengthening my case. But desperate people are unpredictable. I couldn't stop wondering what she'd try next when her tactics inevitably failed. The entire showdown had lasted less than an hour, yet it felt like a turning point. Cynthia had overreached, exposed her real motivation on camera, and earned an official warning. Tom Harris seemed to be pulling back, distancing himself from her increasingly extreme behavior. Even her loyal allies were beginning to realize this wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about one woman's greed and her willingness to bend or break the law to get her way. I called my insurance company to report the attempted tow. To my surprise, they were helpful, reminding me that attempted vehicle theft, whether by a random stranger or someone claiming HOA authority, was still theft if they had no legal right to take it. They recommended filing a police report, something I hadn't thought of but should have done immediately. Every official record, they explained, would strengthen my case if this eventually landed in court. That night, I combed through Emily's footage frame by frame, examining Cynthia's slip about property values and her real estate interests. It was exactly the kind of proof I needed to show this was about her personal profit, not the community's well-being. Paired with the financial records my anonymous source had given me, it drew a clear picture of fraud and abuse of power. The only question left was when and how to use this evidence most effectively. They had pushed me into a corner. But corners can be dangerous. And somewhere inside that birdhouse, a red light blinked twice. That's when I decided to change strategy. Instead of only defending myself from Cynthia's attacks, I'd go on the offensive and let the neighborhood see the truth with their own eyes. The following weekend, I opened my ranch for informal tours, inviting neighbors to walk the property and see the lake boundaries themselves. I hung the county map Patricia had given me right by the boathouse entrance, like a battle standard before the final fight. If Cynthia wanted to claim my land belonged to the community, then let the community come and judge for themselves. The turnout surprised me. Families came with fishing poles and picnic baskets, eager to finally see the lake they'd heard so much about. Children darted along the lakeshore while parents peppered each other with questions about property lines and the HOA's authority. Few of them had ever laid eyes on the official county maps. When they set Cynthia's forged diagrams beside the real documents, even casual observers could spot the glaring differences. Some neighbors admitted they'd never realized the lake wasn't part of their subdivision at all. Tom Harris arrived with a tape measure and a handheld GPS, determined to untangle Cynthia's boundary claims. For nearly an hour, he paced the edges of my property, logging coordinates and comparing them against both the county's records and Cynthia's counterfeit version. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, shaking his head. "The GPS lines up exactly with the county map. There's no chance the HOA's borders stretch this far." His diligence was reassuring, but part of me wondered if I was putting too much faith in him. Tom might truly be chasing the facts, or he could just as easily be gathering intel for Cynthia's next tactic. I'd learned the hard way that people who've switched loyalties once often have no problem doing it again. Still, having him admit the discrepancies in front of others worked in my favor. Word would spread that even Cynthia's staunchest allies were beginning to doubt her version of events. Emily Reed was there too, recording portions of the walk and interviewing residents about the dispute. Her footage would be valuable proof of public opinion, showing that ordinary, rational people could look at the facts and reach the obvious conclusion about who was telling the truth. She asked pointed questions about property rights and HOA power, giving neighbors the chance to voice their unease about Cynthia's increasingly aggressive behavior. That kind of video evidence would be compelling if things ever reached a courtroom. CBs. Sunday night, Cynthia had already heard about my impromptu property tour. As expected, she countered with fear tactics and manipulation. At Monday's HOA meeting, which I skipped but later heard plenty about, she portrayed my openness as a dangerous precedent. "Jack wants to make the lake private," she warned. "What's to stop him from charging you next week? Free tours today, expensive permits tomorrow, maybe even exclusive memberships." It was a clever angle, stoking anxiety over losing something they'd never legally owned. Cynthia had a knack for painting people as victims, even when they were demanding access to someone else's land. She twisted my transparency into proof of future greed, suggesting that letting people visit the lake meant I must be planning to exploit them later. The argument was illogical, but emotional manipulation rarely plays by logical rules. Word spread quickly that not everyone bought her narrative. Several residents pushed back, reminding others that they'd walked the boundaries themselves, seen the county records, and compared them directly to Cynthia's fabrications. Her credibility was weakening, especially with the more thoughtful neighbors who valued facts over fear. But she still had her base, those who preferred simple stories, trusted authority over evidence, and clung to whatever explanation felt easiest. Later that week, I sat down with an attorney, Sarah Martinez, who specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. She outlined 3 possible approaches to handling Cynthia's harassment. First, I could pursue a defamation and harassment lawsuit to recover damages for the stress and financial burden of protecting my rights. Second, I could seek a restraining order to put an end to the bogus citations and false claims. Third, I could dig into the financial side of things, particularly the overdue access road loan Patricia had mentioned. Sarah zeroed in on that last option. If the HOA is behind on payments for the road that leads to your lake, but another question weighed on me. Who was feeding me this insider information, and what did they expect in return? Whoever it was had access to confidential HOA records and was handing me exactly what I needed to dismantle Cynthia's credibility. Either I had a genuine ally inside who wanted justice, or I was being used by someone with an even more complicated agenda. In neighborhood politics, the enemy of your enemy is rarely your true friend. I had my plan, but I couldn't yet tell what counterplay Cynthia was preparing. After meeting with my attorney about exposing the HOA's financial weaknesses, I spent days digging into debt collection practices and loan transfers. Tracking down the specifics of the access road loan turned out to be more of a puzzle than I expected. Searches through public records, county filings, and business directories all led to the same conclusion. After several missed payments, the HOA's infrastructure debt had been sold off to a collection agency. It took nearly a week to find the right people and understand how it all worked. Once the agency realized I wasn't calling to negotiate a payment plan, but instead wanted to buy the debt outright, they were eager to talk. The debt specialist I eventually reached worked out of a small office in a strip mall, surrounded by piles of defaulted loan files. She looked like someone who had spent decades immersed in other people's financial failures. She was almost amused when I asked about purchasing a debt instead of settling one. Most people call to beg for extensions or payment breaks, she said, pulling up the HOA's file on her computer. You're the first who's ever wanted to buy a debt someone else defaulted on. She explained that the access road loan landed with her agency after the HOA missed 3 straight payments. The original balance was steep, but the agency was ready to sell it for a fraction of that amount, more interested in clearing their books than in wringing out every cent. I pressed her for details about the rights and responsibilities that came with ownership. The loan agreement spelled it out. Whoever held the debt also controlled approval for use of the road, since it crossed private land pledged as collateral. As long as payments were made, the HOA could use the road, but if they defaulted, the creditor could cut off access or demand full payment at once. It was a typical setup for infrastructure loans, but it gave the lender heavy leverage over the HOA. She asked why I would want such a toxic debt. I don't like being told I can't park on my own land, I said, which was true enough without explaining the full war with Cynthia. She chuckled, saying HOA disputes often pushed ordinary people to extreme measures. In her line of work, she'd seen firsthand how financial skirmishes replaced civil compromise. The paperwork dragged on for nearly 2 weeks, signatures, notarizations, proof of my financial standing. I had to submit bank statements, income records, and references from business contacts to show I could carry the loan if the HOA didn't. It felt heavier than when I first bought the ranch, mostly because this time I wasn't just defending. What was mine? I was stepping into an offensive role, taking control of something that touched the entire community. When I finally signed, it felt like sliding a chess piece across the board to capture an opponent's queen. Except they didn't even realize it was gone yet. The debt was tied to the lake road, and now I controlled whether the HOA could keep using it. If they missed another payment, I could block their access or demand full repayment on the spot. It was a nuclear option I hoped to avoid, but the leverage itself was power Cynthia hadn't counted on me having. The debt specialist processed the transfer with the casual efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times. "This kind of debt ranks lower than even used car loans," she said, stamping the final page. "We're just glad to move it." I pressed the pen so hard my signature left an impression on the page beneath. I wasn't just buying an unpaid loan. I was buying a say in how the community functioned. The agency made the transfer easy, handing over the full loan history, contracts, and payment records. As I reviewed the documents, I found the terms even more advantageous than I'd realized. Not only did the HOA have to keep up payments, but they were also obligated to maintain the road to certain standards and carry insurance for any accidents or damage. By the time everything was filed with the county, nearly 3 weeks had passed since I first began the chase. And now I held the HOA's road debt in my hands, with the legal authority to control their access to the lake, the very property at the center of our feud. The irony wasn't lost on me. Cynthia's scheme to claim my land had ended with me, seizing control of their way into it. The timing couldn't have worked out better. According to the records, the HOA's next payment was due in less than 2 weeks, and they had already skipped the last 3. If they couldn't pull the money. Together, I would have solid legal grounds to either block access to the road or demand immediate repayment of the full balance. Either outcome would give me a strong advantage in any future negotiations with Cynthia and the HOA board. I kept the debt purchase under wraps, didn't even mention it to Tom Harris or the other neighbors who had been backing me. This was leverage that had to be revealed only at the perfect moment, when it would carry the greatest weight. And Cynthia, she was plotting something. I could sense it in the way she avoided direct conflict ever since the deputy's citation. She was biding her time, gathering support, preparing her next move. But her plans were based on incomplete knowledge of what I now held in my hands. That weekend I sat on my porch staring out over the lake and the road that wound through the trees toward the subdivision. Cars rolled by carrying fishing gear and picnic baskets, families enjoying their day, unaware that their access relied on payments the HOA couldn't keep up with. Before long, they would learn that their association's money troubles went far beyond delayed maintenance or minor budget gaps. The papers were signed. Now it was only a matter of seeing who would show up at the meeting. When I arrived at the community center that Thursday night, the place was overflowing. Cars were jammed along the street for blocks, and people streamed toward the building carrying folding chairs and thermoses as if they were heading to a festival. Word had spread. Tonight's HOA meeting was supposed to finally settle the boundary dispute that had split the community for weeks. Cynthia had promised a conclusive presentation, complete with legal documents and expert testimony, to end the argument once and for all. I carried my folder of evidence and wondered if she had any idea what was about to happen. Cynthia had staged the meeting like a courtroom. Her table sat at the front, rows of chairs all facing forward. She'd brought a microphone, a projector, everything she needed to dominate the narrative from start to finish. Her supporters filled the front rows, nodding in encouragement as she shuffled papers and tested her equipment. Tom Harris sat in the middle. Cynthia staggered back like I'd struck her. The microphone slipped from her hand with a piercing squeal of feedback. "That's not possible," she whispered, but her words carried through the speakers anyway. "You can't just buy someone's debt." I held up the notarized transfer papers, proof that I was now the legal creditor on the HOA's delinquent loan. Deputy Benson, who had been quietly watching from the side, stepped forward and pulled out his citation book. "Ma'am, we've been through this before," he said, jotting quickly as Cynthia's hands shook. "Misuse of emergency services, filing false reports, and now it looks like fraud charges may be appropriate." He tore off a citation and handed it to her, then turned to address the crowd. "Anyone who wants to file complaints about harassment or falsified documents can contact the sheriff's office tomorrow." From the back, a man rose and said, "She fined my wife for hanging a prayer flag. I thought it was just us." Another voice followed, then another. Soon it snowballed. The crowd's reaction was swift and overwhelming. Supporters who had stood with Cynthia now turned on her, questioning what else she might have lied about. Tom Harris stood up and offered a public apology for backing her expansion scheme without checking the facts. "I should have looked at the records myself," he admitted, meeting my eyes. "The GPS data doesn't lie, and neither do the county maps." Others followed his lead, distancing themselves from Cynthia's claims and siding with fairness instead. The meeting dissolved into clusters of neighbors examining the documents I'd brought, comparing the genuine county map with Cynthia's fabricated version. Her carefully orchestrated performance had imploded, exposing her lies to everyone and destroying her credibility beyond repair. And thanks to Emily's footage, the entire confrontation was captured on record, a permanent account of how the dispute came to an end. Cynthia had once circulated brochures promising lake access, without ever getting permission. She'd fabricated boundary documents, staged fake emergency calls, and used every trick she could think of to pressure me into giving in. But now, every one of her schemes was on record, backed by witnesses from the community who could testify to what they had seen and heard themselves. As neighbors began trickling out of the community center, shaking their heads and whispering among each other, I gathered my stack of papers and prepared to leave. The full weight of what had unfolded was finally sinking in. I had won, but the victory didn't feel satisfying. None of this had needed to happen if Cynthia had simply respected property rights and gone through proper channels. Instead, her greed and desperation had torn relationships apart and left a neighborhood divided when we could have been living side by side in peace. The real takeaway wasn't about property lines or debts, it was about character. Pressure has a way of revealing people's true selves behind the polished social mask. Cynthia had proven she was willing to lie, cheat, and even break the law to get her way, but the community, when presented with undeniable proof, had shown something better, that most people will choose truth over convenience and fairness over selfish gain. Karen's name disappeared from the weekly agenda, and her photo was removed from the leadership page of the HOA website, leaving an empty square where it had been. Cynthia, on the other hand, collapsed completely. But was this really the end? Not yet. Not until I knew for certain that no one could ever play queen over this land again. The fallout came faster than I expected. By Friday morning, the HOA board had called an emergency session to strip Cynthia of her role as president and begin repairing the damage she had caused. Tom Harris was chosen as interim president, tasked with restoring the HOA's finances and credibility. His very first act was to stand before me, apologize on behalf of the entire association, and officially declare that every past citation and boundary claim against me was invalid. Deputy Benson kept his word about pursuing the fraud. He filed a detailed report that covered Cynthia's forged documents, false 911 calls, and harassment campaign. The district attorney began reviewing the case for possible criminal charges, while several residents launched civil suits for damages. Cynthia's real estate license came under investigation, and her reputation in the community was in ruins. The financial consequences were even harsher. The HOA's insurance refused to pay for any of Cynthia's fraudulent actions, leaving the neighborhood stuck with skyrocketing legal costs and potential judgments. The original deficit in the maintenance fund, what had started this whole nightmare, was now worsened by attorney fees and the expense of replacing her as property manager. And hanging over everything was the access road debt, which I now owned. The next payment was due Monday, and the HOA didn't have the money. Tom Harris called me Saturday morning, his voice heavy with responsibility. "I know this has all gone far beyond reason," he admitted, "but we're hoping you'll consider working with us on some kind of payment plan that keeps the road open for everyone." I'd been waiting for this conversation since Thursday, weighing my legal rights against my obligations as a neighbor. I could take the nuclear option, cut off road access, force the HOA into bankruptcy, and bring everything crashing down. But that would punish families who had done nothing wrong, people who only wanted to swim and fish at the lake. We met later that afternoon at the community center, the same place where it had all erupted 2 days earlier. Tom arrived with the new treasurer and 2 other board members, all of them carrying the look of people stuck cleaning up a disaster they hadn't caused. I brought my lawyer and a draft agreement I'd worked out over the weekend. The terms were strict but reasonable. The HOA would pay down the road debt in regular installments, maintain the road to set standards, and follow clear rules for lake access. I slid the contract across the table. "Here's what I'm willing to offer," I said. "Monthly payments instead of quarterly, so it's easier for your cash flow. Modest lake access fees that cover insurance and upkeep, but nothing that locks out working families. And most importantly, no more harassment, no more bogus citations, and no more attempts to claim authority over my property." Tom signed the agreement for the HOA, relief visible on his face as he realized families would still have access to the lake. He shook my hand. "I know we don't deserve this after everything that happened," he admitted, "but most of us never supported Cynthia's behavior. We just didn't understand the law well enough to challenge her when it mattered." That Monday evening, Deputy Benson stopped by my ranch with updates. "The DA's office is pressing multiple charges," he told me. "Fraud, harassment, filing false reports, misuse of emergency services. She's facing heavy fines and maybe jail time." He handed me a summons for Cynthia and added with a smirk, "Tell her to start following real laws.